All right, welcome back to our second recording and to our fourth lesson. A little bit darker today, but that's not really a problem, I suppose. Today we are going to talk about the right to take collective action, or as you might know it in, let's say, everyday life, the right to strike. Now, of course, we start with some definition, and we immediately encounter the first difficulty is that it is very rare, actually, to have a legal definition of a strike, a collective action, and as such, we have to resort often to academic definition. Here is a definition taken from the International Encyclopedia of Comparative Law, and I want to point out the various elements that you find in this definition. The strike is first a collective action, so a single person cannot declare and go on strike. Secondly, it is concerted, so it's collectively organized. And in terms of actual action, it consists in the withholding of labor, stoppage of work. Then you also find the definition of the aims of a strike in terms of occupational demands, and also the requirement to be carried out peacefully, that is, without resorting to violence. Now, if the legal definition of a strike is sometimes elusive, the social definition is actually quite consistent. You can see here three pictures, three different historical moments. Hopefully you recognize, otherwise please inform yourself, recognize the fight for 15 in the North American fast food industry. So a strike to request a minimum wage of $15 per hour in the recent years. In the bottom part, you see a strike in the mines in South Africa. And the painting is actually a painting from a Belgian painter, Leermans, at the end of 19th century. And if you look at these pictures, there is actually a very strong continuity. You can see essentially a community of workers moving out of a workplace, be it a mine, a factory, or a fast food. So here, in terms of social reality of the right to strike, there is actually a very strong continuity, as I said, in terms of the history of the collective action that we call a strike. Of course, there are also other types of collective action. We will often talk about the strike, which is the most common, most well-known. Probably you know it. You have encountered it. Maybe it has stopped a journey of your train and made you very angry. So you know what a strike is in social terms again. But there are also other possibilities of collective action, which I'm not gonna explain. Otherwise, where would be the fun? Please take a look, check what these actions mean, because I will ask you to explain them to me the next time we meet. Now, of course, we start to see the different legal orders and how they interact with the right to take collective action. We start with the ILO, and we immediately, again, find the difficult thing is that there is no explicit reference, there is no explicit definition to the right to take collective action in any ILO convention. Of course, however, the right to strike has been recognized quite early by the different monitoring bodies of the ILO. And it has been recognized as an intrinsic corollary, a fundamental element, an essential element, depending on the decision, of the right to organize. You cannot have a trade union, a right to form a trade union without a right to strike. Then the different monitoring bodies have somewhat expanded this protection to other forms. Here you can see sympathy strikes. Sympathy strikes, it's one of the things you have to check, so I will not explain what it is, but you can guess from the decision. Second interesting part is about the aims, the objective of a strike. You can see that strikes which are purely political are excluded from the protection granted by the ILO legal order. However, what purely political means is has to be defined in a very strict way. As you can see in this new slide, Yeah, sorry for the little bit of French that remained there. You can see that purely political strike is something very specific, because all socio-economic policy can be object of a strike protected under the ILO system. So a strike, suppose, against a governmental decision, a reform of, say, the pension system, to take a very recent issue, is actually covered. Okay, so yes, purely political strikes are excluded, but purely political strikes are very extremely rare. Then again, in terms of personal scope of the right to strike, the idea is that for public servant in particular, limitations are possible. However, the monitoring bodies of the ILO have always interpreted this possibility to exclude some civil servant from the scope of the right to strike in a very strict sense, in particular with the limitation to public servants exercising authority in the name of the state, say the police or judges. So states can exclude completely these categories from the right to strike. However, you cannot, under the ILO system, exclude completely all public servants from the right to strike. Again, a state can create prerequisite conditions to declare a lawful strike, but these conditions, let's say you have to give a prior notification if you want to organize a lawful strike, in some countries this is the case, must be reasonable. So restrictions to the right to strike must be reasonable. That's the main aspect of the ILO. Again, the strike can be limited in the context of essential services, but these essential services have to be defined in a very strict and narrow way. You can see the definition. So these services must, interrupting these services must cause an imminent and clear threat to life, personal safety, or health. So, for instance, hospitals are essential services. On the other hand, it might be argued that, for instance, railway sector, something that is often these days, today, considered as essential, might not be so, because interrupting the railway for passengers, for normal traffic, let's say, does not pose a clear and imminent threat to life or health. So, again, very strict definition of what essential services are. Now we go to the European Social Charter. You will see there is a lot of similarities, luckily, so it makes our job easier. Here you have a clear recognition of the right to strike. It is actually the first international instrument to clearly recognize the right to strike. And it is recognized, as you see in the slide, in the context of collective bargaining. This has two consequences. First, that collective agreements can limit the right to strike. There are some countries where collective agreement can include what is called a peace obligation. So a trade union which signs the collective agreement cannot then go on strike to change it for the duration of the agreement. And second, as you can see in the slide, the right to strike is protected under the European Social Charter in the context of collective bargaining. However, there is a very broad definition, as you can see, of what is collective bargaining. So there is the European Committee of Social Rights, the monitoring body of the European Social Charter, has never accepted the limitation of the right to strike only to the situations of negotiation of a strictly defined collective agreement. So any negotiation between employers and workers can be a collective bargaining under Article 6. So it suffices there to be a dispute of interest between workers and employers, and then these will be protected under the European Social Charter. An interesting specification is about the groups who can call a strike, because some countries limit the possibility to call for a strike to trade unions. And the European Committee of Social Rights has said this is okay, as long as it is easy to create a trade union. So if you can just create a trade union on day 1 and on day 2 declare a strike, then of course there is no real limitation. However, you cannot, under the European Social Charter, limit the right to go on strike to the main trade union, to most representative trade unions, because also smaller trade unions must enjoy this right. You can see that the question of the right to strike of public servants has also been dealt with by the European Social Charter, the European Committee of Social Rights, with very similar conclusion than the ILO. So I will not go into this anymore. Finally, an interesting decision, since we are in Belgium. I mean, at least you are in Belgium right now, probably, is a decision about picketing. And I hope you know what picketing is. Otherwise, check it up. Google it. So the question was whether picketing itself was covered under the right to strike. And the committee gave a decision. It was about Belgium. It was brought by the 3 Belgian trade unions. The committee gave a decision which is the following. As long as picketing does not force the other workers to participate in the strike, then it's okay. However, if there is intimidation or violence towards other workers, then it's not protected under the European Social Charter. And this is a very difficult decision to analyze, because as you can read in the first passage, what is protected is the right to choose not to participate in a strike. But suppose you cannot physically get into your workplace because there is a picket line, you are not necessarily participating in the strike. You just cannot get to your job. So again, difficult decision to interpret, and it has been, for your information, interpreted very differently by Belgian judges. So its impact is not yet clear. However, it is clear is that picketing without violence is covered by the right to strike under the European Social Charter. The history in the context of the European Convention on Human Rights is a little bit different. We have seen together that the European Convention protects the right to form a trade union under Article 11, but of course it does not refer to the right to strike. And the history of the European Court of Human Rights is a history of a progressive recognition of this right. We start with an older decision in 72. The application was in 72. And here the court said, well, the right to strike is an important element of the freedom of association, but it is not necessary. Okay, there are other means for a trade union to be heard, to protect its members. So we will not protect the right to strike under Article 11. More recently, at the end of the 90s, in a case against the United Kingdom, the court for the first time said that it would consider restrictions to the right to strike under Article 11, so in a way implicitly saying that Article 11 protects also the right to strike. So Article 11 paragraph 2, which as we have seen allows for some restrictions to the right protected by Article 11, will be used by the court to analyze restrictions to the right to strike. Then the occasion came to actually apply this doctrine. As you can see, this is in French, but it is not because I forgot to translate it, but it is because there is no official translation of this case on the website of the Court of Human Rights. So I cannot quote an unofficial document. If you Google it, again, you will find the press release, which can explain something. However, I will explain what it is in the slide. Here, the court said it was a case against Turkey, and the Turkish government had enacted a government decree banning a strike in the public sector. There was a strike which was already planned, and the day before the government says no, it is forbidden for public servants to go on strike. People still go on strike and they are sanctioned. So a very extreme case, if you want. And here the court says it borrows the very words of the ILO to say that the right to strike is an important aspect of the freedom of association, and as the ILO says, an essential element of this right. As such, the court analyzed the restriction enacted by the Turkish government under Article 11, paragraph 2, and concludes that this complete prohibition of the strike was not necessary in a democratic society, and hence in violation of Article 11, paragraph 2. Finally, most recent decision, RMT, which is a trade union, the Railroad and Maritime and Transport Workers Trade Union, against the United Kingdom. Here, the question was whether a sympathy action was protected under Article 11. And the conclusion of the court, you can see here, is that the right to strike is clearly protected under Article 11. So, okay, we know that the right to strike now is part of Article 11, a human right, the right to associate, the freedom of association, the right to create and join trade unions. However, the Court of Human Rights made slight distinguishing of the sympathy strike. So the court says, if there is a restriction of the core of the activity, let's say of the right to strike itself, then this is the margin of appreciation is very narrow. However, a restriction on a secondary element leaves a wider margin. And in this case, it was a question of a sympathy strike. So yes, this time I have to explain it to you. So spoiler alert, a sympathy strike is a strike where workers go on strike in solidarity with other workers on strike. So workers go on strike although they do not have demands vis-a-vis their employer, but to support other workers. And this is forbidden in the UK completely. Okay. And the UK had been condemned by the ILO monitoring bodies, by the European Committee of Social Rights because of this. So the trade union thought they had a very good case. However, as you can see, the European Court of Human Rights was very cautious and said this is actually a secondary aspect of the right to strike. So the margin of appreciation is wider. And in the end, it confirmed the compatibility of the UK ban, total ban on the right to of the sympathy strike as compatible with Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. There is also an interesting point you can see here in the second paragraph in the slide that the court considered also as an argument the fact that government of different colors, the Tories government, and then the government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, so the Labour government, had confirmed this ban. The court said it was an argument to say that there was a democratic consensus over this ban of sympathy strike, which, if you think about it for a moment, is a strange argument from a human rights court, because human rights, by their definition, are meant to protect against the majority, are meant to protect minorities, are meant to protect opinions which are not shared. In this case, however, the court, let's say, was influenced, so to speak, also by a political argument, and maybe also was influenced by, let's say, the very uncertain situation of the UK considering international commitments. Remember what's happened afterwards. It was not unheard in the UK to call for leaving also the Council of Europe, in fact. Now, speaking of the UK, we go to the EU legal order. Now, in the EU, for a very long time, the idea was that the right to strike had nothing to do with EU law. You will remember from our first lesson that the treaties provide for a complete exclusion of the competence of the EU in the field of the right to strike, an explicit exclusion of competence. However, with the development of the internal market, more and more often there were situations where a strike might influence the internal market. So there was, at the end of the 90s, a regulation. The name was the Monti 1 regulation, and Monti was the name of the commissioner for the internal market at the time. So the Monti regulation was about ensuring the free flow of goods without interruption in the internal market. And there was a fear that ensuring the free flow of goods might be used against a strike. Imagine a strike of the railway sector. Okay? If there are no trains, then of course also commerce of goods might be hindered, might be hampered. So there was this fear that EU law could be used to limit the right to strike. So the regulation says explicitly, as you can see in Article 2, that the regulation itself cannot be used to limit the right to strike. However, this evolved during time. In the case of Schmid-Berger, it was not a case of a right to strike. It was a peaceful assembly. There was a protest in Austria against opening or works on a highway for environmental concerns. And this protest had blocked the border between Italy and Austria for 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. So there was a transport company which brought an action against Austria, so not against the protesters, against Austria, because the Austrian authorities should have banned the demonstration in order to guarantee the free flow of goods. Okay? And the court said a very important, of course, probably you know already the Schmid-Berger case. If you don't, well, you should. So in this case, the court said an important thing, said the respect of fundamental right might be a legitimate interest which justifies a restriction of the fundamental freedoms of the internal market. So freedom of establishment, free movement of goods and capitals, free movement of services, and free movement of workers. Okay. So here the Austrian authorities were protecting a fundamental right by allowing the demonstration. So the restriction to the free movement of goods and hence the damage suffered by Schmid-Berger was justified. With the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, we have a recognition of the right to strike in Article 28. You can see it in the slide. However, it's a very limited recognition if you read the text carefully, because as you can see, the recognition of the right to strike is in accordance with the union law and national law and practices, which means in theory that all of union law, all of national law can limit the right to strike. So it's a very weak fundamental right, if you want. And exactly this happened in two very important cases. It's difficult to overstate the importance of these cases for the EU in general. Okay, so please take time to familiarize yourself with these cases. The first case was Viking, and the second case was Laval. You might have heard of those already. They are often mentioned in the context of what is called social dumping. So in the Viking case, essentially, to make a long story short, it was a case of delocalization, if you want. There was a ship, a boat, and the owner of the boat wanted to reflag it, to change the flag, and hence the law applicable from Finland to Estonia to profit from better, in the eyes of the employer, working condition, meaning lower wages. So the International Transport Worker Federation had issued a boycott of this reflagging, change of flag, saying that no other trade union should negotiate with the owner of the boat, only the Finnish trade union. So you change the flag, but we don't care. We will still negotiate Finnish standards. So it was a question of a clash between fundamental right, the right to take collective action, and freedom of the internal market, the freedom of establishment, because changing the flag was exercising the freedom of establishment for the owner. And the court concluded that this action was a restriction to the freedom of establishment because it went beyond what it was necessary. And it is done precisely under the doctrine of Schmidt-Berger, saying that the exercise of fundamental right must be reconciled with the freedoms of the internal market. Now, this paragraph is particularly unfortunate if you read it carefully, because the other case, Omega, which is very similar to Schmidt-Berger, in the Omega case, the fundamental right at issue was the human dignity, okay? And the Court of Justice of the European Union says, well, the exercise of human dignity should be reconciled with the requirement of the internal market, so economic freedoms. Let's say, not the best moment of the Court of Justice, and this is still, it has never changed its mind, this is still the case law, applicable case law of the Court of Justice. Fundamental rights in the European Union, when they meet fundamental freedoms of the internal market, must justify themselves. They are, at best, justified restrictions to the internal market. And this process of justification is done under what is called the principle of proportionality. You should know how it works. Just as a reminder, there are 3 steps. Whether the restriction is based on a general interest, whether it is justified. Second, whether it is necessary to pursue this general interest. And third, whether it does not go beyond what is necessary to pursue this general interest. 3 steps of the test of proportionality, but you surely know this perfectly already. The second case, the evil twin of Viking, is Laval. In this case, it was a question of the freedom to provide services. There was a Latvian company which had won a public contract in Sweden to build a school, so construction work, and it went with its own workers. And it was applying to its workers Latvian working conditions. So the Swedish trade unions were not happy about it, and they organized a collective action, which was a blockade, as it's called, meaning the trade union did not allow any work at the working site. And then also in a sympathy action, the electricians' trade union cut electricity to the working site, meaning it was impossible to work. And this was perfectly legal under the Swedish legal order. The Court of Justice, of course, said although the European Union has no competence about the right to strike, you can see it in the slide, when the right to strike is exercised, it still must respect EU law. The court also refers to a number of documents which we have seen together, you see, to say that yes, the right to strike, the right to take collective action is indeed a fundamental right. Fun fact, little parenthesis, you can see there the court refers to Convention number 87 of the International Labour Organization. However, as we have seen, 20 minutes ago, so I hope you still remember this, there is no mention of the right to strike in the ILO Convention. So the question here is whether the Court of Justice is in a way recognizing the case law, the decisions of the monitoring bodies of the ILO as let's say, important document in its decision or not. It has never done so explicitly, so we are left to wonder. So the conclusion of the Court of Justice is that the boycott of the Swedish trade union actually makes the work of the Latvian company less attractive in Sweden. You can see it, less attractive, and as such it's a restriction of the freedom to provide services and should hence be justified. Okay, So the question is, you can see here, does it pass the proportionality test? And the conclusion of the code is it doesn't. It doesn't. And the reason why is that the wage that trade union were asking the Latvian company to apply to its workers, which was the normal wage in the building sector in Sweden, was not actually a minimum wage, because Sweden does not have a legal minimum wage. And as such, the court has said, well, if this is not a legal minimum wage, if it is not mandatory, then it is not necessary. Okay, then it's not necessary. So the proportionality test failed at the necessity step. Okay, so the Court of Justice concluded that the collective action carried out by the Swedish trade union, perfectly legal under the Swedish legal order, was a violation of EU law, and in the end, the trade union was condemned in Sweden to pay damages. Afterwards, a solution, let's say, was found by the Swedish government, but this was the decision of the Court of Justice. The interesting thing is that then there were other evolutions in the other legal orders, in particular in the ILO, but also in the European Social Charter, which led to a completely different conclusion. And this will be your task for the rest of the week, but let's wait for a second and conclude about the European Union. So afterwards, a few years after these cases, so these were decided at the end of 2007, a few years later, the Commission proposed a new regulation to try and solve this situation. It was called the Monti II regulation because it was inspired by the same idea that we saw in the Monti I regulation. However, this is not exactly the same because, as you can see, Monti I regulation said this regulation does not affect the right to strike. It was completely excluded. Here, it is very different. It's what is called a symmetrical, let's say, proportionality test. So the restriction to the fundamental freedoms of the internal market by the right to strike should be proportionate, but also the restrictions to the right to strike from the fundamental freedoms should be proportionate. However, this proposal was met with a lot of critiques, among many others, also yours truly. You can, if you really want to, you can find an article where I criticize this proposal. And the very immediate thing that it was clear is that under this test, it was very difficult to see how the economic freedoms would themselves restrict the right to strike. Okay, it's very difficult to see how, for instance, providing a service or moving a company from one country to the other restricts by itself the right to strike. However, the right to strike very easily restricts fundamental freedom. So it was thought that this was, in a way, a trap, and that would have essentially led to the very same situation, but now enshrined in stone in a EU regulation. So in the end, this proposal was struck down. Also in terms of competencies, it was not clear whether the EU had the competence to enact this regulation. So in the end, there was enough opposition to this proposal that the Commission decided just to withdraw this. So, the much anticipated thing that you have to do before we meet again. So first, please read the Viking decision. It's not too long for such an important decision. But second, it's also on eCampus, read the report of the Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations of the ILO about the UK. It is the so-called Balpa case. It's 2 pages, don't worry. It's also on eCampus, you will have a very difficult question to answer. The question is there a conflict between these 2 legal orders? And if there is, spoiler alert, there is, What can you do to solve this? Imagine that you are a member state of the EU and of the ILO. And this is the case of all the members of the EU. How do you deal with a situation where the EU and the ILO tell you two different things? What can you do? What solutions and outcomes can be envisaged? I expect creative answers, and we will discuss this next week. Thanks.